Welcome back to part 2 of this cheap eBay guitar kit that I'm putting together. And if you missed the last episode, go ahead and check it out. It's where I unboxed this and did some trimming and sanding and got this sweet belly cut contour right here. But now we're on to staining. And I start off on the back here, and I've just got coffee, and I'm trying to get like a nice amber hue here, and it works. It absolutely works. The problem, because this is raw wood, is the grain raised so much that I essentially had to sand all of that color back off, and it was like a waste. And so I move on to the front here, and I'm just going to tape this off just even with the binding, and so I don't get any on that mahogany. And what we're using here is RIT fabric dye, and I'm mixing it with water because this veneer is so thin I didn't want to like bleed completely through that and then not be able to sand enough color back out. So I probably went 50-50 water and dye, and then I wound up going back and mixing more dye in to get the color that I wanted. And we're going for like a sunburst effect, so I bought pink and purple and blue, with purple being the main theme. So what I did on the lightest section is with that 50-50 water, it's also about half and half purple and pink, maybe a little bit more pink than purple, and then it's just straight purple in the middle and then purple and blue on the edge. And like I said, we just had a test piece of wood that we used to get our colors dialed in. And now I'm just kind of going little bit by little bit, kind of where I'm wanting the gradient to happen. And so I start out in the center with this like pink purple, and then on the edge of that I move to just my straight purple, and then you guessed it, on the very edge of the guitar I'm doing my blurple. This is probably the most satisfying part of the entire build, just getting to see where everything kind of lines up and really customizing how the guitar looks. And it's just, I don't know, I really enjoyed this part. I did go over the entire surface of this with steel wool before I started dyeing, and I wish I would have used like a really fine sandpaper. You'll see why here in a minute. But at any rate, until then, you can just watch me dye. That's DYE, not DIE, but I'm not monetized, so it doesn't matter anyway. If you weren't paying attention, I am using 3 different rags, one for each color, and then I used the purple rag that's basically nearly dry back now, and I'm going over everything more or less to kind of try and blend that in. I go really light on the pink part because I don't want to just erase what I've done, because obviously you can make it darker, but you can't really make it a whole lot lighter. This is where I was showing you that I wish I would have sanded it just a little bit. There's glue on this veneer. It was unnoticeable until it wasn't. Obviously it just didn't take the dye like the rest of the veneer did. I tried several things, like putting more dye on it, or like rubbing that, or steel wool with dye in it to see when it would come out. I basically wound up having to sand that back down and then just fill it back in with dye again. Anyway, when I got that where I liked it, I let that sit for about a day, and then I started taking off the tape to see how bad of a job I did on this little cutaway here, which is not a big deal because you can just take a little bit of sandpaper and smooth it out until, you know, your lines are pretty clean. And that worked pretty well. I mean, I definitely would still pay a lot of attention to taping it off because it makes it easier when you only have a little bit to sand. I wouldn't want to sand the entire thing out, but, you know, worst case scenario, you can make it look pretty good even with, you know, an okay tape job. I grabbed a little bit of rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip here to kind of clean up the edge of this veneer and this binding as best I could, because obviously it was like blurple on it from the blue and purple dye, if you remember from like 3 minutes ago. And finally kind of just give up and go back to the old sandpaper trick and hit all the binding with that. It worked out like really well. I'm using 220 still, so it's fine. Moving on to the neck. If you watched the last video, you noticed that I said that it fits pretty well together. So much, in fact, that it's too tight, in my opinion. It's uncomfortable to try and force it in there. So I'm going to lay a piece of 220 grit sandpaper down on my table so it's nice and flat, and then just run the edges of the neck heel back and forth little by little, and then about every 30 seconds or so I'm checking to see if it fits. I also lightly sand anywhere that glue is going to be in contact with this when we connect them, so I'm going to sand the bottom of the heel as well as the pocket and both sides going up the body, just everywhere that glue is going to touch, so it got really good adhesion. And of course, this whole time I've tried to keep everything even, sanding the left and the right side about evenly, but just as I, get everything to fit to where I'm not having to smash it together with a mallet, I decided to try and see how straight the neck is. And what I do is I just take a ribbon and tie it through the tuner holes up top center it up, and then bring it all the way down to the bottom, and then just look along the neck to see where that ribbon falls. And while I've got the neck in the neck pocket, I go ahead and kind of mark off where everything is going to line up, and then tape that off so I don't get finish in that and make that the wrong size again. Of course, I go ahead and tape up my fretboard here because you don't want finish getting on that as well. And then when I move up to the tuner holes, I take painter's tape and then just wad it up into balls and cram it down into these holes. And then I put my finger on the back side and use a pencil to kind of mash it flat. And that way you don't wind up with finish in your holes because you can just, cover them. And what I'm using here is just a polyacrylic that is a water-based clear coat, basically like polyurethane, except it's water-based. And since I used water-based dye, I thought it was probably a good idea to stay with that theme. So for this first coat, as per the instructions, I grab a brush and I am just brushing this everywhere, which is an absolute nightmare on everything that's not just perfectly flat and straight. And so shortly thereafter, I decided I've got to do something different on the coats going forward. I just sealed the back and sides first because I need something dry to lay down flat while it's drying. And so here's where I was talking about on not brushing. They make wipe on polyacrylic or polyurethane. That's not what this is, but I thought I'd give it a shot and I would start on the neck, and if it screwed up, I was just screwing up the neck and I could just sand it back down. It goes on so much smoother this way, for me anyway. It's a much lighter coat and I can just control where it's going into all the nooks and crannies, and it's just so much more pleasant to apply. And you still have to sand between coats, but you don't get any brush strokes. And again, you're not putting down just a ton of product that you've got to remove half of later because it gets blobby or whatever. To me, I don't know why the instructions didn't just say to wipe it on to begin with. I do, because they sell other product that is specifically designed to wipe on, but this works so much better for me. So going forward, all of my coats after the first one, I wiped on. I wound up with a grand total of 2 coats on the neck, 3 coats on the headstock, and 4 coats on the body. Now between each coat, the initial sanding on the first coat was 220, and on the body I did 220 every coat but the last one, which I finished at 600 and 800. On the neck I used 220, and then I used 220 again, and then I wound up going to 600 and 800 on it. And then on the front I did 220 on the first coat, I did 600 on the next 3 coats, 800 on the final coat with that 600, and got everything just as smooth as I could with sandpaper. Somewhere in the middle of all these coats, I decided that I would wipe down all the sanding dust with rubbing alcohol, which seemed like a great idea, and it's probably fine, but then I thought to myself, this is water-based poly, so it's possibly removing some of that just because of, like chemical reactions and stuff. So I decided to forego that, and if I was going to wipe it down with anything other than just a dry towel, it was just going to be a damp cloth. I did learn that you just want to go as thin as possible basically on these coats, because if you try and go thick and heavy, you're going to wind up with bubbles and runs and stuff, and it's just going to be more sanding. So just do more thin coats rather than heavy coats. It'll wind up being a better, easier project in the long run. I didn't record every coat and sanding because you sitting through what you already have was torture enough. But after my final 800 grit sand, I decided that it's time to polish it, and all that I have is this Mothers, and it says that it's safe for all metals, and I'm kind of into hard rock, but Breaking Benjamin's probably the heaviest thing that this guitar is going to play, but I figured it was safe anyway. It's pretty self-explanatory, kind of like if you've ever waxed a car. I just kind of rub it in and then let it sit for, 5 to 10 minutes, and then I just grab my wax buffer and just knock off as much as I can. Obviously there's nooks and crannies that you can't get to with that, like with everything else in this project that I had to get by hand. That is the fun of a hand-built guitar. And here you can see where I got greedy on that last coat and it wound up costing me. But same story as the back, got it sanded to 800 and then put that Mother's polish on it and then put my buffer on that, wiped off anything that was left. And it's got like a really nice satin finish to it. I know the poly said that it was gloss, but I guess with everything that I've done to it and my crap of a polish job, maybe I can only get satin. But I really like it, especially now that I've seen the finished project. Spoiler alert, love the way it came out. And on to gluing this neck. Like I said, we had that pocket cleaned out, everything sized up, and then you just put glue in it. That's how that works. Kind of brush everything around so I got good contact everywhere. And then we're going to set this in here. I've put a board and a piece of cardboard under the guitar so that I'm not clamping on that finish that I've got. Of course, it's been a couple of days at this point, and then I just run my clamps over the top. I put another piece of cardboard down just to kind of fill the gap. I didn't have to because I'm in the piece of wood that the pickup sits on. It won't be seen anyway, but I did that just to take some space up. And at any rate, you just clamp it and then make sure everything's where it goes before you clamp it, and then that's it. You know, you let it sit. The glue that I used was Titebond 2. It came highly recommended, and it says that you can leave it clamped for 30 minutes and then take the clamps off, and then full stress, don't put any on there for 24 hours, but I left it clamped for 24 hours. And just as a comparison on that sheen, this is my Schecter Raiden 5, and it's got a high gloss finish. Obviously, this is not a high gloss finish, but I really love the way it came out. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope y'all enjoyed. Hit that subscribe button, and next time we're going to put hardware and electronics in this thing. See y'all then.